Hello, my name is Sherry Avila, and I am the hostess for Making a Difference. And today I have as my guest Karen Kruse. Hello, Karen.
Hello.
And Karen is the author of a book called A Chicago Firehouse, Stories of Wrigleyville, Engine number 78.
Correct.
And Karen has been written up in the Booster and in the other local papers, and she's also been written up in the Chicago Tribune and the Chicago Sun-Times. We're very privileged to have Karen as our guest today.
Thank you.
And Karen, we'd like to you to tell us about your father and how you got to write this book.
Okay. Incidentally, the cover of the book is my father's helmet. In 1956, he paid $21.50 for that helmet, and now they run somewhere in the neighborhood of $238, so you can see how times have changed. I took the picture of the helmet in the backyard many years before I decided to do the book. A friend of mine had suggested that I write for Victoria magazine. They were looking for reminiscing stories. So I told the story of when I was a little girl and I used to go to the firehouse. For those of you who don't know, Engine 78 is located directly out the left field line of Wrigley Field. So if I'm home plate, the firehouse is located in extreme left field across the wall. I used to go to the firehouse once a year. That was a treat for me. So this is really the forbidden fruit. Dad has been trying to keep me out of firehouses for 40 plus years. We used to go to the firehouse and I'd sit on the engine and the fellows would feed me. You know, they'd give me a lot of ballpark food. And when it was time to go to the game, we'd walk across the street. We'd sit up in the left field against the wall and I'd watch the firehouse because that's where my heart was. The fire guys would get, you know, their runs, and they'd pull out on Waveland, and this is when they still rode the back step, and they'd look up at me in the stands, and they'd give me a wave, and that's how a little girl falls in love with the fire department and firemen in general. So that little story I put together and sent to Victoria magazine, and they printed it, and something happened in the back of my little pea brain. I decided, I says, you know what, they printed it, I must be a writer. I says, you know what, Dad, it's time. I'm going to write about the firehouse I fell in love with as a little girl. And that was the impetus to start the book.
How did you get Mike Ditka to write the foreword? I noticed that Mike Ditka wrote the foreword in here.
Yes, he did. That's an interesting story. During the 60s, he was drafted by the Bears organization in 1961. And this is the heyday for him, as well as the years my dad was at the firehouse was 1956 through 70, was at that particular location. And Mike Ditka used to come in and sort of sit in the kitchen with the guys and shoot the breeze. So when I was starting the book, my dad says, you know, Ditka used to come in all the time. I says, well, Dad, you're not scaring me. So I wrote a letter to Mr. Ditka. He was a coach with the New Orleans Saints at the time. And 2 weeks after I mailed the letter, I received a call from his secretary. And she said, you know, I have Mr. Ditka on the phone. Would you care to take the call? And I said, you know, no, my nails are wet. Of course I'll take the call. So I did, and he was warm and friendly, and says if I needed anything, he'd be there to help. I never have met the man. We've gone back and forth through his secretary, and when it was time to do the foreword, he came through like a trooper. I'm very, very pleased to have him. And on a side note, I also have Commissioner Joyce. He did my preface, and I'm thankful to the Chicago Fire Department for standing behind me and giving me their backing from the beginning.
What did you learn from this experience?
I learned in the 30 years my dad was on the job, he was thanked once for saving a life, and that bothered me. It wasn't the reason I wrote the book. I wish it was. I wrote it because this is my favorite little firehouse, but in the process of working on the book, that's what I discovered, that Dad was thanked only once in those 30 years, so I'm very proud of the fact that I write emphatically that firemen need to be thanked and appreciated for what they do, and that came out 5 months. It came out in May of 2001, long before the rest of the world sort of got on my bandwagon after the events of September 11th. Now the world sort of sees that the firemen need to be thanked and appreciated, and I've been sort of beating that drum for over 40 years, so I'm very proud of that fact. I was able to put that in print.
What is your favorite story in the book?
My favorite story is my dad putting out the hot dog stand at Wrigley Field. My mother was at home ironing once upon a time, and this is back in the 60s, you know, when you used to iron everything. And I was 3 years old at the time, and she was ironing and had the Cubs game on because it was sort of nice, mindless activity. And all of a sudden the camera swung over to the right, and I see we have the picture up now. This camera swung over to the right. WGN televised this, and there's my dad putting out the hot dog stand. What had happened was these hot dog carts at the time went through the stands, and it caught on fire. He says it was so hot that it melted the change on the top of the vendor's cart. They had to actually hook a line to the hydrant, which is which is a neat trick considering you're inside the balls of the baseball park. But he put the fire out, and he says he got an ovation by 20,000 fans. And of course, my mother watched the whole thing on TV. The next day, of course, the newspaper clipping came out, and I've had that in my collection ever since. That's been a very important story, and just sort of, it's one of the only fires that Wrigley Field ever had as well.
Could you give us an unusual incident? That sounded pretty unusual to me, to be honest with you.
Sure. We just celebrated Martin Luther King's birthday recently, and during the time when he was assassinated in 1968, the west side of the city was burning, and my father was called. All the firemen's leaves were canceled, getting to work, and he basically worked from one end of the street to the other putting out fires. Well, he was gone for 4 days, and we had no idea where he was. Was he in trouble? Was he being hurt? And somewhere about the third day, there was, the phone rang about midnight. My mother answered it, and it was my dad. He had been crawling through a burning building, and his elbow sort of hit an end table, and a Princess phone fell down in front of him and fell off the hook, and it lit up. So he knew the lines were still good, and he sort of dialed. Now picture this, he's crawling through a building, and the fire is rolling over his head as he's got his hose line, and he's on the phone. He calls Mom and says, "Don't worry about me, I'll be okay. By the way, what time is it?" She's like, "Midnight." So I don't think she slept another wink after that.
Why do Chicago firehouses have the red and green lights?
This has been my little quirk since the beginning. I've always been fascinated by them. You'll notice I'm wearing red and green angels on my shirt, and I do that not only for my little lights, but I do that because I had, I think, a lot of help from the other side writing this book. The easy answer is a commissioner by the name of Goodrich was a part of a shipping concern line. His father had a big shipping business on the Great Lakes in the 20s, and this man was also a fire fan. He was not a firefighter. He never worked his way up. Every Chicago firehouse has it, and it represents port and starboard. They are always on. There's not any mystery to, if they're going or coming, and some people think that if they're out of the house it's one color or not, and that's got nothing to do with it. It's just the man did it because he could, and that's the easy answer. Incidentally, the apparatus, the fire apparatus, not the ambulance, will have one green light over the officer's side. So as it's coming towards you, it will be on the right side, will be the green light, and that represents the same thing the front of the engine, the house has.
I didn't even notice that they had lights.
I've been noticing that since I was a little kid. So this is something that I was just bound and determined to find out when I worked on this book, and I'm very pleased that I was able to get some help. I got some tip-off, and a wonderful librarian helped me with this, and she found the commissioner's report where he ordered the red and green lights and the red doors. As a child, I was always taught if I was in trouble to go to a firehouse. More than any other place, and to this day I feel that's a safe haven for me.
Could you give us a flavor of the Wrigleyville neighborhood that we might not have known? But
sure.
Before you start off on that, I just want to comment. I did comment this to you before when we were talking, that my husband and I, when we were first married, did live in the Wrigleyville area, and his mother in fact owned a 2-flat on Wilton, and they were very involved with Wrigley Field.
One of the things that many people don't know, the things that I put into this book I found interesting, and if I didn't find them interesting, they didn't go in there. Fire fans will often ask me, do you have the makes and models of every engine that was in the house? And the answer is no, because I don't find that interesting. I find that sort of tedious. One of the things that I found was an interesting quirk was the firehouse is located on Waveland Avenue. And in the time when a man named Joseph Sheffield had bought 2 40-acre plots of what you now know as Lakeview, Sheffield was named after him, and the lake was much closer in those days, so it would inundate during storms. The lake water would come over and sort of slosh on the cross street, so that's why he named it Waveland, and that's where the name Waveland comes from. It actually does mean that the waves came over on that street. One of the other things I like to point out is at the corner of Waveland and Kenmore, which is a quarter block or half a block down east of the firehouse, there's a big building that says Budweiser on the top of it now. And it said various things over the years. The silent movie actress Gloria Swanson was born in that building. She was discovered at SNA Studios just north of there, but she was born on the second floor of the building, and I went to great lengths to prove that she was born in the building. It was something that firehouse lore, the firemen knew of it, and I went, researched that when I started working on the book, but all the pieces fit, and that's sort of a neat little detail.
Now, do firemen tend to know who all the people are that live in the houses or buildings around them?
Some yes, some no. I ran into a man recently that his cousin is pictured in the book, and the reason is because the kid used to hang out there when he was a teenager. And now this man is living in one of the suburbs and contacted me after the book came out, and he says, well, my cousin's pictured in there, how do you know him? And I says, I don't. It was just, a newspaper clipping that I had. But certain kids, especially kids really like to go to the firehouse, and the firemen are always wonderful. They've always treated me like gold when I have been there, and I wasn't allowed to hang out there, so that was sort of the frustration, because I would have loved to, but I wasn't allowed to. So it was a once-a-year thing for me.
I used to teach school, and I taught pre-kindergarten and kindergarten and first grade, and we always went to the fire station.
Absolutely. I went as a third grader, and I was quite upset that some kid in my class, we went to his father's firehouse, and I thought I knew more than they did. I was quite upset, and it was like, hey, I should be the star of the show. So.
Can you give us what your favorite detail is that you uncovered?
My favorite useless detail is when a home run ball leaves Wrigley Field and bounces up Kenmore past the building that Gloria Swanson was born in. It's going the wrong way up a one-way street. The one-way comes from the north to the south, and the ball is going northbound. And this is another one of those goofy things that Dad told me when I was writing the book, and I said, you're nuts. He says, go and look at the sign. So I took a hike down from the firehouse, and sure enough, there's the one-way sign pointing towards the ballpark. So I was quite surprised by that, but he was right again, and that's another fact that I found out as I worked on the book. Dad came up with a lot of stuff that I thought I knew a lot, and I did. I knew a lot until he started telling me more. So I have a very well-rounded education now in the fire department.
Now, how has this book made a difference?
The difference has come out in the fire children that have come out of the woodwork. They've come out, they've embraced it, they've thanked me for putting their dads in the book. They says, thank you very much. These guys would have been lost to history without me. Their names would have been on a roster down at City Hall, and that would have been it. But by me giving them life and some character and some, stories attached to them, I've sort of left their mark on society as well, and the children are really grateful for that. I've been able to connect with many of the kids that I didn't know existed. All of a sudden, I'll get a call or an email, and they'll say, my dad worked with your dad, and when I hear the last name or the maiden name in the case of a lot of the women, I'm usually absolutely flabbergasted that they've come through that way. The children have been absolutely wonderful, and I've been very proud to know them, but my dad's been able to talk to many of the guys that he's lost touch with over the last 30, 40 years, and it makes me feel good that my book has brought these people together, and it's renewed old friendships.
I have a cousin, Danny Downs, who lives in Peoria, Illinois, that's a fireman, and he just retired recently. But he went over to New York City. I mentioned this to you before, and he attended these great funerals for all the firemen who passed on in New York, and he said it was a very touching experience. He actually had to retire because his knees gave out on him.
That happens to a lot of the guys.
Because he said he was crawling around on the floor underneath the smoke, getting through the buildings, and he said you can only crawl so much.
That's right. That's right.
What is the most meaningful thing that's happened to you?
The most meaningful has been the opportunity to give the eulogy for a firefighter that is mentioned in the book. The family has come to me, and they asked me if I would give this man's eulogy, and I thought they were crazy. But I did it. Not only did I do the eulogy, and I was very proud to have done it, but the family embraced it, and they says nobody in the fire family understood. Nobody in their family understood unless you were part of the fire department. The fire department is extremely close-knit, and this was important to them, and I was extremely happy to do it for them.
With that, we'll take a quick break. Hello again. This is Sherry Avila with Making a Difference, and this is my guest, Karen Kruse, who is the author of A Chicago Firehouse, and it's about the Wrigleyville engine number 78 firehouse. Karen, who have you heard from regarding this book?
I've heard from a number of important people. Donald Rumsfeld sent me a thank you note. He is a Chicagoan, and I wanted to send it to him for a bunch of reasons, and I did get a very nice thank you note from him. Probably the most international I've heard from is Paul McCartney. His father was a volunteer firefighter, and that's why Paul started doing concerts after the events of 9/11, because he realized what a fireman does and how he wanted to give back. His stepdad apparently was already gone, and he realized what they did. So Paul has sent me a very nice note. I've heard from both Mayors Daley and former Mayor Giuliani. And my favorite is Governor Blagojevich. He definitely read the book by the comments he had made, and I was very pleased to hear from him. He went to the same high school my dad did, and that sort of gave me the idea that maybe he'd like to see how another classmate had turned out, you know, and what his story. And the governor, I'm told, is a fan of Chicago history, so he was very engrossed by it, and I was pleased that he enjoyed my work.
That's very, very exciting. Did they send photos with their letters?
No, but they do sign an autograph letter, and that's very nice for the scrapbook.
Oh, yes.
So I'm very happy to have it.
Yes. What unusual things have happened to you since you've written this book, besides getting letters from famous people like Paul McCartney?
I've pretty much played Cinderella. When I did an event last summer, I was asked if I wanted to ride in an open cab fire engine and help put it away from the fire museum. So there I felt sort of like Cinderella, you know, had her pumpkin. I had my fire engine, and we drove it through the city to go put it back away at where they keep the apparatus for the fire museum. And I was happy to do it. I mean, people were standing on street corners sort of staring, and once I start waving, they started waved back. I've been able to, a friend of mine asked me if I wanted to ride in a biplane, and we went over Wrigley Field and the firehouse, and with tears running down my face, I took pictures of the firehouse down to about 700 feet. The interesting thing about that is 4 months later it was a no-fly zone, and I wouldn't have been able to have that chance again. I've pretty much been able to do a lot of neat things that I never expected would happen, and I'm looking forward to riding possibly in the St. Patrick's Day Parade this coming spring.
And I understand that you're one of the founding members of the Fire Museum.
Yes, I have founding member status. We're looking for a permanent home for the museum, and I understand that's going to happen probably within the next 2 years.
Next 2 years?
Yes.
Yes, and we're hoping to have the members of the Fire Museum on.
That would be great.
Oh, and we want to remember to remind everybody what your website is, too. What's your website?
It's www.achicagofirehouse.com. You can get more information there. Contact me. Say hello. Love to hear from you.
There's your website up there now.
Thank you. Thank you.
I remember one of the things that was brought out that I read on your website was that there's no privacy in the fire station, and I was wondering if you could speak to that.
Well, 78 is one of the rare houses that even an officer doesn't have his own room. Most officers have sort of their officer room. They can lock it up. They can be by themselves. The officer sleeps with the men in that house. It's just a bunk room. It's just one room with a bunch of beds. There's no privacy, and there is a separate bathroom on the first floor, so if you had a woman there, you know, she could use that as opposed to the other one. I've been up there twice, and both times I've been escorted to make sure the guys weren't up there, but it's not a co-ed type thing.
Are the new firehouses?
The ones being built definitely have separate facilities. This house was built in 1915, so it was just built as a firehouse with, you know, the normal amenities at the time.
Mm-hmm. And how did you, I understand there's an article about you on promoting yourself in order to sell your book that was in the Chicago Sun-Times.
The Sun-Times came to me and said they'd like it from an author's perspective, how they do promotion and how they get name recognition. And I put that together, and what I'm proud of is it came out on Father's Day 2 years ago. On that Sunday supplement, it was the lead story about how a firefighter's daughter shamelessly pitched his book.
That's exciting to get an article printed in the Chicago Sun-Times.
I was absolutely thrilled, and it was the editor that came to me, and the fact that they asked me to do it, I was absolutely blown away. I was pretty surprised that they would ask me to do such a thing, and I was very pleased that they didn't edit me as well. You know, either I saw the edited version and it didn't change from how I wrote it, so that made me feel that I did the right thing.
And that came about because of your doing a, they asked you to speak at your Midwest Writers Association.
I've spoken at the Midwest Writers Group. I've spoken in a Southwestern Wisconsin group. I speak to a number of writing groups on the craft of writing and getting published. That's something that I've become very adept at because I sort of went through the process.
Well, I think that the fact that you took your childhood and built it into a book is absolutely amazing, and I'm very impressed by that. And I think it's great that you honored your father in such a manner by writing this book about him. Are there any last words you'd like to say?
You know what, you touched on it. I'm very pleased with the fact that I honored my dad while he's still here, and I can sort of watch him, and it's kind of nice to do it. And it was an unexpected benefit because I didn't know I didn't know this would happen. This was just something that I did, and this has been a nice little sideline that, you know, he's been able to see sort of what's happened because of it.
I don't know if we still have time, but you mentioned something about some special cemeteries, or some firemen are buried in some cemeteries?
The Roseville Cemetery has a specific spot that the Chicago Fire Department erected a monument to our volunteer firefighters. There are a number of firemen buried under there, and that's actually considered the firefighters cemetery, is at Roseville Cemetery on Ravenswood. It's a magnificent cemetery, and that's a whole other subject. I'm very well versed on that one as well.
Well, we'll have to have you back for another show and talk about the cemeteries.
Absolutely. I'd love to do it.
Well, it was nice to have you on our show, Karen.
Thank you very much for having me.